Okay, shall we get started? So we'll just go through workshop 11 with the multiple choice questions first and then the short answer questions. Two topics. So first we look at international trade, basically based on comparative advantage and assuming we tend to have win-win outcomes between countries that trade with each other. And after that we look at exchange rates. So the first 5 multiple choice questions are on international trade. And the first one asks you what is a tariff, right? So this is relatively simple, right? Because a tariff really is simply just another word for a tax, right? So you know what a tax is, right? You have the GST in Australia. You buy something for $10, 10% of that was tax to the government, right? So a tariff is simply a tax on a product that comes from overseas that is imposed by the government, right? So let's say you have cars and the cars would sell for $10,000 and then the government might put a tariff of 10%. So let's say this is car from, I don't know, Japan. Cars from Japan. The Australian government puts a 10% tariff on that. So that's going to be $1,000, right? So the Australian consumer will pay $11,000 for the car. 1,000 of that will go to the Australian government in the form of a tariff. Okay, so that's the case with question number 1. Excuse me, trying to sort this thing. I'll just move that to the side again. I will see if I can get that done. Okay, we will ignore that. Okay, so that is a tariff. Then we go to question number 2. When a nation starts importing a good or service, the domestic production of that good or service will decrease. So your answer is A. So with question 2, when we're talking about importing, remember we are assuming international trade is a win-win scenario, right? So nobody is forcing you to do anything, right? So when you are going to import the product, that suggests that your country does not have the comparative advantage in the production of that good or service, right? You do not have the comparative advantage. So you are going to be importing the good because another country can produce that good or service at a lower opportunity cost than your country, right? So obviously, once your consumer starts buying the foreign product rather than the local product, the domestic production of the good or service will decrease, right? So this goes back, if you have a look now, we have no longer got any production of cars in Australia, right? What happened was Australia used to produce many cars, but since Australia does not have the comparative advantage in the production of cars, Australian consumers were more willing to buy foreign-made cars, which were cheaper and better quality. And eventually the production of Australian cars started to decrease and ultimately just stopped producing cars in total. Okay, so for that case, question 2, it will decrease. And again, I don't know how to move that, but there we go. Okay, question number 3. Question number 3, we have a diagram over here, and it says the figure shows the Australian demand and supply curve for cherries. Okay, and we can see, if I just draw that one out, we have the quantity of cherries, the price of cherries, the demand for cherries, the supply for cherries. Here we've got 2.5, here we've got 50 cents, and we can see that without any international trade, cherries would sell for $1.50 a kilogram, and 400,000 kilograms of cherries would be bought and sold in Australia, right? And now they say the world price of cherries is $2 a kilogram. World price of cherries is $2 a kilogram, the world price. Okay, world price, PW, $2. So what we see here is that the world price of cherries is greater than the domestic price of cherries, which is $1.50. Okay, so this would indicate when the world price is higher than the domestic price, that Australian cherry producers have a comparative advantage in the production of this good. So they will start exporting this good overseas. Okay, so when they start exporting this good overseas at $2 a kilogram, they will also start charging the Australian consumer $2 a kilogram, right? They will say to the Australian consumer, too bad, the Japanese are willing to pay $2 for it, so you got to pay $2 for it as well. So the Australian consumer will end up consuming 200,000 kilograms of cherries at the world price, right? Because the Australian price is no longer available to the Australian consumer. Okay, so your answer is going to be B. Okay, so now oops, I don't know how to move this thing to the side. Come on, there we go. Okay, so we go to question 4. Now we're told the world price of a good is below the no trade domestic price, right? Below the no trade domestic price. This is basically going back to question number 2, same situation. So this is the opposite of question number 3. Okay, so what we're saying with question number 4 is the world trade price, PW, is less than the domestic equilibrium price, P star. Okay, so this would be in Australia, the classic situation for the car industry. Australia does not have the comparative advantage in the production of cars. So the Japanese or the Koreans or the Germans, can produce cars at a lower opportunity cost, and hence they can give you the product at better value for money, right? I mean, we use, to a certain extent, we're not giving you the whole story because the German car is obviously more expensive than an Australian car, but it's just better value for money. It comes with, all the shebang inside. But we sort of ignored that and we just said, let's just assume the world price is lower than the no trade domestic price. And in that case, we say the country will benefit from importing the goods. So question 4, your answer is D, right? So for example, if we draw a graph, quantity, price, and we assume there is no international trade. This would be the demand for cars in Australia. This would be the supply of cars in Australia. And with no international trade, I don't know, let's say 1 million cars are bought and sold, and the price of the cars would be, let's say, $10,000 each, right? But now you can get the foreign car, which is cheaper than the Australian car. The foreign car is going to be cheaper than the Australian car. So we've got your PW, let's say $7,000. Okay, PW, that one should be. Let me try and write that out properly. PW. So at this cheaper price, the Australian consumer at $7,000, because the price has now fallen, price goes down, quantity demanded goes up, the Australian consumer, instead of consuming 1 million cars, might now end up wanting to consume 2 million cars, quantity demanded. Okay, but the Australian producer at $7,000, the inefficient ones cannot produce the car at that price. The efficient ones can. Maybe you can produce, I don't know, 0.5 million cars, quantity supplied. And then the difference between these two would be your imports. In this case, 1.5 million cars will come in from overseas, right? So you can see in this scenario, the Australian consumer is the winner. The consumer wins because they can buy more cars at a cheaper price. And the Australian producer is the loser because they sell less cars. Not only do they sell less cars, the price they get for it is less as well. Right? So they're winners and losers. But as we discussed in the lecture, the general evidence suggests that the size of the win is greater than the size of the loss. So the net gain to society, where we assume society is made up of buyers and sellers, is positive, right? So with comparative advantage at play, if a country is importing a good, it will benefit from importing the good. Okay, so question 4, the answer is D. So now let me just put that to the side. We go to question 5, the last multiple choice question for international trade. When protection is encouraged to protect a growing domestic industry, which of the following is being used? The answer is A, the infant industry argument. Okay, infant industry argument. So with question 5, we say your country does not have a natural comparative advantage, right? So far, we've been sort of implicitly assuming your country just happens to have the lowest opportunity cost at the production of a good or service. In reality, that's not always true. Occasionally, a country can create that comparative advantage, right? So the South Koreans did it very successfully with the shipbuilding industry, right? South Korea was not good at building ships. The Korean government decided back in the 60s it wanted to be the world leader in the production of ships. So what it did was it protected its infant shipbuilding industry. They just started a shipbuilding industry, and they told the shipbuilding producers, we'll protect you for 20 years. We'll put a very high tariff on foreign ships. So Koreans who want to buy ships will have to buy the lower quality Korean ship because the tariff is too high. And the better quality foreign ship, and the Swedes were the best at this, simply couldn't compete on that basis. But you have 20 years to do it. Okay, so you protect them for 20 years. You got 20 years to learn how to do it. After that, we're not going to help you anymore, right? So, infant industry, a little child, you want that child when they're an adult to be very independent. But when they're 2 years old, you got to take care of them. So that's the general idea. That's the infant industry argument. Okay, then we got the multiple choice on the exchange rates. But let's skip that now and just go to the first short answer question, because the first short answer question is based on international trade as well. And then we go back to the multiple choice questions for exchange rates. Okay, so we got the question here. The supply of roses in Australia is made up of Australian grown roses and imported roses. So the question is already telling you that in this country, or in Australia, you're importing roses, right? So that's already telling you that the world price of roses must be less than the Australian domestic no trade price of roses. Australia must be importing the product. Okay, so Australia does not have the comparative advantage in the production of this product. And indeed, we know that for a fact. Australia tends to import flowers from overseas, right? So it is not a made-up question, really. It's the truth. Okay, so draw a graph to illustrate the Australian rose market with free international trade. On your graph, mark the price of roses and quantities of roses bought, produced, and imported into Australia. Okay, I mean, we basically have drawn the graph already, right? This was the graph that we drew, that I drew just now about when talking about cars coming into Australia. Same graph. Okay, so let's just draw a situation out here. Let's start with a situation where we assume there is no international trade. So this is the demand of roses in Australia. This is the supply of Australian produced roses. And with no international trade, equilibrium will be, let's call that Q1, and the equilibrium price will be, well, I said it was P star. Okay, so I'll keep it at P star. So I will change that to P star as well. I'll just be consistent, Q star, sorry. I will just rewrite that Q star. Right, so this is where we are. And you can give it a price, right? You can say $10, for example, right? You can say, I don't know, 1 million units, whatever, doesn't matter, right? And then what is the situation with free international trade? Well, we are assuming here that the world price is going to be less than the domestic no trade price, right? So it must be less than $10. Okay, so we know our world price, PW, could be, I don't know, $7, let's say. Oops, $7. Okay, so the question says, draw a graph to illustrate the Australian rose market with international trade. Okay, we've done that now. On your graph, mark the price of roses. What's the price of roses? here, world trade, $7. Okay, where did I get $7? I just made it up. The key is just to show that the world price is less than the domestic no trade price. Okay, I've done that. The quantities of roses bought, produced, and imported. Okay, so how many roses will be bought in this situation? Well, these many roses will be bought. You know, call that QD, give it a number if you want, let's say 2 million. Australian consumers will buy 2 million roses at $7 with international trade. But Australian producers will produce less than that, because at $7 they can produce much less, let's say 0.5 million roses. I'll call that quantity supplied, Australian quantity supplied, S. And so the difference is going to be imported. And how much will be imported? Well, 2 million minus 0.5. So 1.5 million would be imported. Okay, so now on the graph, we have already shown you the price of the roses. We have shown you the quantities bought, 2 million. We have shown you the quantities produced, 0.5 million. And the quantities imported, or at least we've shown you the distance the quantities imported. And then you can write a sentence and say the amount imported will be 1.5 million roses. Okay. So that's essentially how you answer a short answer question like this. You draw the graph, make sure you answer the question, and then you write a sentence per explanation, really. So question like this, you've seen the model answers we've provided. 3 sentences, 4 sentences, and you'll be fine. Okay, so oops, I'm just trying to, there we go. Yeah, make that smaller, and I'll try and move this somewhere over there. Okay, so now what we do is we go to exchange rates. So we go back to multiple choice questions 6 to 10. So I'll make that as small as I can, move that to the side. Okay. So the first one, or the sixth question, which is the first exchange rate question, is relatively straightforward. It's just a definition of what the exchange rate is. Well, its answer is A, the price at which one currency exchanges for another, right? So for example, I can say 1 Australian dollar, AUD1, changes for I don't know, 60 cents. Okay, so that's an exchange rate. That's it. All we're saying, this is a price. 1 Australian dollar will get you 60 cents. That's the price that it changes for another, right? So that's just simply it. Right? Question 7, when a currency depreciates, we say its value has fallen against another currency. So your answer is A. So with international trade, I started by saying we're assuming win-win scenarios. International trade, we assume, is good for both the countries. But with exchange rates, it's win-lose. If your country's currency is stronger relative to the other currency, that immediately means the other currency is weaker against your currency. Okay, so for example, let's say 1 euro buys you, let's say, $1.10 US, and then, so that's, I don't know, today. So today is what, 28th January. But tomorrow, on the 29th of January, your 1 euro can buy you $1.12 US. So the euro has become stronger relative to the US dollar because now you get more US dollar for every euro. So the euro has become stronger. It has appreciated in value, which means the opposite must be happening. The US dollar is going to be depreciating in value. Okay, depreciating in value. If you just hang on a second and I'll just get a calculator out, we can calculate that. Right? Because you can look at it from the other point of view. On the 28th of January, so on the 28th of January, when 1 euro was worth $1.10 US, that means $1 US was worth with rounding 0.91 euro cents. Right, so these two are saying essentially the same thing. Okay, but on the 29th of January, 1 US dollar is going to be getting less euros. How much less? I'll just calculate on my calculator over here. 0.89 euros, right? So you can look at it from the point of view of the euro. The euro is getting stronger. Or from the point of view of the US dollar is getting weaker, right? So when one country is appreciating, when one country's currency is appreciating against another, that means the other currency is automatically depreciating against the other currency. Okay, so what about the next question? Sorry, next question, question 8. Today, 1 Australian dollar exchanges for $1.10 US. The next morning, 1 Australian dollar exchanges for $1.07 US. Right? So it's quite similar to this question over here we just did. Just move this over. Right? So what are we saying? We are saying that the Australian dollar must have depreciated and the US dollar then must have appreciated, right? Because if one Australian dollar was getting you $1.10 US, and then the next day 1 Australian dollar is getting you $1.07 US, then the Australian dollar is getting less US than before, right? You used to get $1.10, now you get $1.07. So the Australian dollar must be depreciating, right? Which means, given the question we discussed just now, the previous question, question 7, the US dollar must be appreciating, right? Because this is equivalent, if we flip it over, and we say 1 US dollar is getting 91 US cents. And the next day, 1 US dollar is getting, I'll just get my calculator and work that out. $0.93. Right? So the US dollar is getting stronger. When the Australian dollar gets weaker against the US dollar, automatically the US dollar is getting stronger against the Australian dollar. Oops. Move that off somewhere. Okay. So then we can go to question 9, multiple choice question 9. When Australia exports goods and services to Japan, we will see that there is an increase in the demand for Australian dollar. So your answer is A. Right? So what's happening here? Right? When Australia is exporting goods and services to Japan, so let's say Australia is selling, I think the example I said, what is particularly popular in Australia for that tourists buy and foreigners like to buy are those boots that the women like to wear, quite famous brand called the Ugg boots. Right? So the quite famous Australian made boots would make a good example to answer this question. right? So let's say you have Japanese consumers and they used to buy 1,000 Ugg boots from Australia, and now they're buying 1,200 Ugg boots from Australia. So they're increasing their demand for the Ugg boots, which means there is an increase in exports from Australia's point of view. From Australia's point of view, there's an increase in exports, right? So the Australian producer is selling to the Japanese customer, but the Australian producer wants to be paid in Australian dollars. But the Japanese customer has money in Japanese yen. So what happens is the Japanese buyer has to go to the money changer and change the Japanese yen for Australian dollars, and then give the Australian dollars to the Australian exporter, right? So when the Japanese consumer is buying more Ugg boots, they are changing more Japanese yen for the Australian dollar, which means that there is going to be an increase in the demand for the Australian dollar. Oops, sorry, I will increase in demand. I'll do that again in a different color pen. There's going to be an increase in the demand for the Australian dollar. Okay, and what that looks like, because you can look at this on a graph, so we can draw that out. An increase in exports of the Australian dollar. So let's say you have the graph. Here is the quantity of the Australian dollar bought and sold, AUD. Here is your exchange rate. Here is the demand for the Australian dollar originally. I'll call that D0. Here is the supply of the Australian dollar originally. So originally, before there was an increase in the Ugg boot sales to Japan, Q0 units of Australian dollars were bought and sold. Could be a large number, $10 billion worth of Australian dollars, for example, being bought and sold. And the exchange rate, call it whatever you want. We can call it ER0, right? You can say 1 Australian dollar is equal to 100 Japanese yen, whatever, just be consistent. Okay, and then what are we told? What has happened? Well, we are told that there's been an increase in exports of Australian products. In this case, my example is the Ugg boots. Japanese consumers used to buy 1,000 Ugg boots. Now Japanese consumers are buying 1,200 Ugg boots. Okay, so that means they have to exchange a lot more Australian dollars, right? So that increase in the exports will lead to an increase in the demand for the Australian dollar. Okay, which means you can draw up a new demand curve. I'll use a different color to show you that. D1. Right? So there's going to be an increase in so there's going to be a shift in the demand curve. Shift in demand curve. You've gone from D0 to D1. And what are we going to see there? We're going to see that there is going to be an increase in the quantity of Australian currency being traded, right? So there's going to be an increase in the quantity of the Australian dollar traded. And the Australian dollar is going to appreciate. The Australian dollar is going to become stronger. There's going to be an increase in the value of the AUD, the Australian dollar. There's been an appreciation of the Australian dollar, right, relative to the Japanese yen, right, relative to the Japanese yen. So have we answered the question? Yes, we have. The answer is A for question number 9. Okay, question 10. As the Australian dollar exchange rate blank, Australian exports will blank and Australian imports will blank. Okay, so we're asking you what is the relationship between the value of the Australian dollar and our exports and imports. Right, so we covered this quite well in the lecture. What we are essentially saying to you is, if the Australian dollar is strong, what you will see is there will be a fall in exports and a rise in imports. Right? And this makes sense because when the Australian dollar is strong, foreigners will buy less Australian products because they need, when they exchange the money, they lose out. Right? So they will buy less Australian products. So hence, Australians' exports overseas will fall. But it's cheaper for Australians to buy foreign products because when you exchange the money, the foreign product seems very cheap, so imports will go up. Okay, and then the opposite occurs. When the Australian dollar is weak, there will be an increase in exports and a decrease in imports for exactly the opposite reason. It's cheaper for foreigners to buy Australian products, so they will buy more Australian products and Australian exports will increase. But for Australian consumers, buying the foreign product is no longer so attractive, so imports will fall. Now, this is why I said in the lecture that the idea that a strong currency is good for a country, which many people hold to be true from an economics point of view, is not as obvious. In fact, I personally would argue a weak currency is what you as a country would probably like to have in not all circumstances, but most circumstances, because exports can be a large income earner for a country. Okay, so we go back to the question, and as you work out the options, you'll see that option C is the correct one, as the Australian dollar exchange rate appreciates. So the question is saying, as the Australian dollar gets stronger, as the Australian dollar gets stronger, Australian exports will fall, and Australian imports will rise. So your answer is C. Okay, trying to make that smaller. Come on. Can't seem to do it. Let me just move that to the side somewhere. Now we're going to answer the short answer question. Okay, and we've already drawn this when we answered the question of what happens when the demand for UGG boots go up. This is going to be the same graph. What is expected to happen to the Australian dollar as a result of the 2018 Commonwealth Games being held at the Gold Coast? Illustrate your answer, right? So illustrate your answer, draw your graph. Okay, so you got to think about it. What happens to the Australian dollar when the Gold Coast hosted the Commonwealth Games, right? Well, what tends to happen is a lot of foreigners come to visit. When foreigners come to visit, they're going to spend money in Australia, right? So tourism into Australia is considered an export. So there would be an increase in the Australian export. Okay? So when the foreign tourist goes down to Cavill Avenue and go to the shops and they buy things, they will have to change their currency for the Australian dollar. So there's going to be an increase in the demand for the AUD, right? Because let's say you are a tourist from Canada. If you're a tourist from Canada and you want to buy some tourist products from the tourist shop, you cannot pay 10 Canadian dollars for the product, right? You have to pay in the Australian currency, so they have to change the money. Okay? So what will it look like? Well, it will look pretty much like the question we did earlier. Right? So I will draw my diagram. This is the quantity of Australian dollar, and this is the exchange rate. Right? You know, this is the value of the Australian dollar in terms of the other currency. So you can see in the model answer we gave you, we wrote value of Australian dollar in British pounds, right? But you can just write here exchange rate. That's fine, no problem. The original demand for the Australian dollar, the original supply for the Australian dollar, the original quantity traded, the original exchange rate, I'll call that ER1, FX1, whatever, 0. Okay. Okay, and then we were told more tourists are spending money on the Gold Coast, so that's considered an export increase, which means those tourists have to change the money into Australian dollar. There's a demand, an increase in demand for the Australian dollar. So we simply show that up. There's an increase in the demand for the Australian dollar to D1. Right? So there's a shift in the demand curve. Shift in the demand curve. You've gone from D0 to D1. There's been an increase in the quantity of the Australian dollar traded, and the Australian dollar has appreciated. It has become stronger relative to that other currency. Right? An increase in the value of the Australian dollar relative to the other currency. Okay, it has appreciated. And that's essentially it. That's the tutorial. So just work out the options. In an exam scenario, I'm much more likely to ask you the opposite situation than the one I just showed you. Okay, good luck practicing.